All right, Henry George Day Devotional 16 coming your way. I'm recording this early because I'm going to be out of town on Monday and Tuesdays, but I wouldn't want you to miss another day in your habit. So I left off complaining about this sentence from Henry George. The precise time of the payment of wages is immaterial. The essential point, the point I lay stress on, is that it is after the performance of work. And I was complaining that it should be for the performance of work. Well, I mean, duh, it's for the work. Everyone agrees that a worker gets paid for their work. The question that George is talking about is the source of that compensation is from the work. And on that point, I completely agree with George. The source of your compensation for labor is the labor. Uh, and I agree that the precise time of the payment is immaterial. I just still think that this little after bit is, at least it's confusing. Maybe it's confusing because I have such an acute mind, like all the other acute minds that have had trouble with this. Because he literally just said you could have your labor, your wages advanced to you. Um, I don't know. Maybe I'm just being nitpicky, but I think we can move on, or we're just going to move on. Okay. The payment of wages, therefore, always implies the previous rendering of labor. Now, what does the rendering of labor in production imply? Evidently, the production of wealth, which, if it is to be exchanged or used in production, is capital. Therefore, the payment of capital in wages presupposes a production of capital by the labor for which the wages are paid. And as the employer generally makes a profit, the payment of wages is, so far as he is concerned, but the return to the laborer of a portion of the capital he has received from the labor. So far as the employee is concerned, it is but the receipt of a portion of the capital his labor has previously produced. As the value paid in the wages is thus exchanged for a value brought into being by the labor, how can it be said that wages are drawn from capital or advanced by capital? As in the exchange of labor for wages, the employer always gets the capital created by the labor before he pays out the capital in the wages. At what point is his capital lessened even temporarily? Footnote. I speak of labor producing capital for the sake of greater clearness. What labor always procures is either wealth, which may or may not be capital, or services, the cases in which nothing is obtained, merely exceptional cases of misadventure, where the object of the labor is simply the gratification of the employer, as where I hire a man to black my boots. I do not pay the wages from capital, but from wealth which I have devoted, not to reproductive uses, but to consumption for my own satisfaction. Even if wages thus paid be considered as drawn from capital, then by that act they pass from the category of capital to that of wealth, devoted to the gratification of the possessor, as when a cigar dealer takes a dozen cigars from the stock which he has put for sale and puts them in his own pocket for his own use. Yeah, I was looking forward to, I didn't know if it would be a footnote or where, but when George talks about labor producing, or labor in service industries. I think we live in a much more service industry society in America now, and so it's a little unfortunate that George doesn't talk about the service industry as much as he could. But I know later in the book, perhaps much later, he talks a lot about the wages of everyone being sort of constrained to the wages somebody could get on like marginal land, which in effect speaks to our like minimum wage issues, which is a much bigger deal nowadays, I think, because most is that true? Most minimum wage jobs are service industry people. I don't know about that statement. Whatever. this is just a demonstration that Georgism applies to service jobs as well. They are paid not from previous capital stored up, but from a like pool of wealth. Wealth being wealth being wealth, but capital is again a form of wealth that is set aside to produce more wealth. And so, if I have something that I could use to make more wealth, but I instead use that wealth to gratify my desires, then that wealth never became capital. Or if it was capital, it turns back into wealth when I use it to gratify my desires, like having someone black my boots or give me a massage. Anyway, we continue. Bring the question to the test of facts. Take, for instance, an employing manufacturer who is engaged in turning raw material into finished products, cotton into cloth, iron into hardware, leather into boots, or so on, as may be, and who pays his hands, as is generally the case, once a week. Make an exact inventory of his capital on Monday morning before the beginning of work, and it will consist of his buildings, machinery, raw materials, money on hand, on band, typo, I think, money on hand, and finished products in stock. Suppose, for the sake of simplicity, that he neither buys nor sells during the week. And after work has stopped, and he has paid his hands on Saturday night, take a new inventory of his capital. The item of money will be less, for it has been paid out in wages. There will be less raw material, less coal, etc. And a proper deduction must be made from the value of the buildings and machinery for the week's wear and tear. But if he is doing a remunerative business, which must on the average be the case, the item of finished products will be so much greater as to compensate for all these deficiencies and show in the summing up an increase of capital. Manifestly then, the value he paid his hands in wages was not drawn from his capital, or from anyone else's capital. It came not from capital, but from the value created by the labor itself. There was no more advance of capital than if he had hired his hands to dig clams, and paid them with a part of the clams they dug. Their wages were as truly the produce of their labor as were the wages of the primitive man, when, long before the appropriation of land and the accumulation of stock, that was in quotes, he obtained an oyster by knocking it with a stone from the rocks. As the laborer who works for an employer does not get his wages until he has performed the work, his case is similar to that of the depositor in a bank who cannot draw money out until he has put money in. And as by drawing out what he has previously put in, the bank depositor does not lessen the capital of the bank, neither can laborers by receiving wages lessen even temporarily either the capital of the employer or the aggregate capital of the community. Their wages no more come from capital than the checks of depositors are drawn against bank capital. It is true that laborers in receiving wages do not generally receive back wealth in the same form in which they have rendered it, any more than bank depositors receive back the identical coins or bank notes they have deposited, but they receive it in equivalent form. And as we are justified in saying that the depositor receives from the bank the money he paid in, so are we justified in saying that the laborer receives in wages the wealth he has rendered in labor. I have no comment on that paragraph. It's so clear and good. That this universal truth is so often obscured is largely due to that fruitful source of economic obscurities, the confounding of wealth with money. And it is remarkable to see so many of those who, since Dr. Adam Smith made the egg stand on its head, have copiously demonstrated the fallacies of the mercantile system, fall into delusions of the very same kind in treating of the relations of capital and labor. I assume the term stand the egg on its head is a positive good thing, and I assume the mercantile system is a bad explanation of economics, but I don't really know what the mercantile system is. Tell me in the comments. Money, being the general medium of exchanges, the common flux through which all transmutations of wealth from one form to another take place. Whatever difficulties may exist to an exchange will generally show themselves on the side of reduction to money, and thus it is sometimes easier to exchange money for any other form of wealth than it is to exchange wealth in a particular form into money. For the reason that there are more holders of wealth who desire to make some exchange than there are who desire to make any particular exchange. I'm reading that sentence again. Sometimes easier. No, see, there's a weird capitalization of the word sometimes, but I don't think that's not when the sentence. This is a long sentence. Yeah. Boom. Long sentence. Here we go. Money being the general medium of exchanges, the common flux through which all transmutation of wealth from one form to another take place, whatever difficulties may exist to an exchange will generally show themselves on the side of reduction to money, and thus it is sometimes easier to exchange money for any other form of wealth than it is to exchange wealth in a particular form into money, for the reason that there are more holders of wealth who desire to make some exchange than there are who desire to make any particular exchange. And so a producing employer who has paid out his money in wages may sometimes find it difficult to turn quickly back into money the increased value for which his money has really been exchanged, and is spoken of as having exhausted or advanced his capital in the payment of wages. Yet, unless the new value created by the labor is less than the wages paid, which can be only an exceptional case, the capital which he had before in money he now has in goods, as it has been changed in form, but not lessened. There is one branch of production. Wait, we're at 12 minutes? Well. I guess we're done for this episode of the Henry George Daily Devotional. Like, subscribe, share the land.